All right, welcome in everyone. Welcome to the first in Clean Water Action's Trash Talk series. Tonight we're going to be talking about chemical recycling, or how to use technology to make a bad problem worse. As we go along, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box, and we will circle back around to them at the end of the presentation. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Meher Akrami. I am the Chesapeake coordinator here at Clean Water Action. So that means I get to work with folks in Virginia, in Maryland, and in Washington, D.C. around sustainability and trying to mitigate and prevent harm from all sorts of pollution and different issues in the environment. I am joined this evening by Shamika Preston. Shamika is a dedicated community advocate based in Howard County, Maryland, and a candidate for Howard County's council. She serves as the co-facilitator of the Stop Grace Coalition, which is a grassroots group formed to oppose W.R. Grace's proposed chemical recycling plant near their homes in Columbia. Shamika has a master's degree in marketing, which will come up later, nearly a decade of professional experience. She's a wife, mother, fur mama, and a friend to those who passionately fight for a healthier and safer future for all. Thanks for being here, Shamika. So, tonight we're going to talk about chemical recycling. What is chemical recycling? Some of you may be asking. So, chemical recycling is it's an umbrella term. Sometimes it's also called advanced recycling. So if you see those two interchangeably, you know it's the same technologies. But it's an umbrella term for a lot of different technologies. What the chemical industry pitches it as is a high-tech way to deal with hard-to-recycle plastic, like that film you get around your basically everything. That's really hard to recycle. And the chemical industry says, yeah, and chemical recycling is how we'll do that. In reality, it is a set of technologies which break plastics down into their component parts called polymers and produce a whole lot of waste doing it. They do it by burning them or at least applying caustic chemicals to them. So some chemical recycling facilities just use caustic chemicals to break them down. That is not the most common form. Most chemical recycling facilities are pyrolysis or gasification processes where they use heat and chemicals to break plastics down. I am going to walk through some pyrolysis background. I'm going to tell you sort of how it works because those are the most common. Those are usually what you're going to be seeing whenever you're reading about chemical recycling or, heaven forbid, experiencing it in the real world. How it works. You have a pyrolysis incinerator. This can take many different forms. That's one of the tricky things about chemical recycling is it is an umbrella term for a lot of things, which means a lot of different things fall into this category. So I can't tell you exactly how every process will work, but I can give you a general view of how they work. So you have a facility that is effectively an incinerator, is definably an incinerator, defined as such by the EPA, in which you feed plastic of all different kinds. But that's another sort of challenge here because it can be a lot of different kinds of plastics, but the overall thrust of it is plastic goes in the fire, along with a catalyst. So in this case, what I mean by catalyst is a chemical that helps the plastic be broken apart. So sometimes that means a chemical that helps the plastic be broken apart at a lower temperature. Sometimes it means helps it be broken apart more thoroughly. Again, the catalysts come in a whole lot of different forms, and most frequently, the catalysts actually being used in these processes are proprietary information for the company doing the process. So that means we don't necessarily know what these chemicals that are being used are, which is one of the many challenges with this technology. So plastic chemicals go into this fire. What comes out the other side? The plastic gets broken down, and what comes out is a low-grade oil. It's called pyrolysis oil. I'll probably just call it the low-grade oil, just because pyrolysis is a complicated word. But only about 20% of the plastic that goes into the incinerator comes out as oil. Actually, 20% is like the high end. That's if things are working perfectly. 20% comes out as oil. Often it's not that efficient, obviously, as things are in the real world. So does the other 80% go? That's the next obvious question. And the answer is it comes out as one of two kinds of waste. First, the majority of it comes out as emissions into the air. So this plastic is broken down, it's broken into a gas, some of it is condensed into an oil, most of it ends up as that remainder of the gas that's going out. They process it in different ways to mitigate somewhat the environmental impact. We'll get to it in a second. Unfortunately, this process is very, very environmentally toxic and bad for people around it. But just for now, keep in mind, the majority goes out as emissions. Another portion of that 80%, though, comes out as char. So in this case, char is basically just a broken down, melted, minute quantity of plastic. So this is definitely the smallest amount that comes out, but there is solid plastic at the end of this. Technically, it's not plastic if you want to get really, really defined, because it's actually just burnt polymers. It gets complicated, but more or less, it's plastic. And a really important thing to keep in mind is this char is one of the most contaminated things you could come across, because all of the toxics that are in that catalyst, any toxics in the plastic that was burnt, is left over in that char. And it is really highly toxic stuff. So that's the 80%. So right now, you're probably thinking to yourself, this doesn't really seem like recycling. You would be correct. There's nothing circular about this. Plastic goes in, and waste byproducts come out in large part, and a smaller portion comes out as this low-grade oil. The reality is this low-grade oil could probably also be called a waste byproduct for the most part. It is incredibly toxic, like to the point where studies show that when this oil is processed into jet fuel, 1 in 4 people exposed to it, like workers, would develop cancer in their lifetimes because of that exposure. If it's developed into boat fuel, it was actually found that one of these fuels would result in every single person exposed developing cancer in their lifetimes. That's a 100% cancer rate from this. This fuel, this oil, and the fuel that comes from it is incredibly toxic. This oil can also be turned into other chemicals, and sometimes, very, very rarely, this almost never happens, it's turned into other plastic. I cannot tell you how vanishingly small the percentage that actually gets recycled in the plastic is. For the most part, it turns into this oil, which is then turned into fuel. Very toxic fuel. And the emissions are going into the air, and we have to talk about that. So let's talk about the environmental and health impacts of chemical recycling. So these emissions can contain dioxins, volatile organic compounds like benzene, formaldehyde, some particulate matter, heavy metals like mercury and arsenic, PFAS, forever chemicals, probably heard of those. Specifically, all of these things are different mixtures, different amounts, but always present. It depends on the plastic that is being fed into the process. Different kinds of plastics will result in different mixtures of emissions. For example, the PFAS is more likely to be present if the plastic that was being fed into it was contaminated with PFAS, or forever chemicals. Often in a real world circumstance where you're bringing in plastic from really any source that is recycled, like it's recycled plastic, it is going to be contaminated with PFAS. It's extremely common. So these emissions happen from chemical recycling facilities. They happen in different quantities, but they just happen measurably. This is something that has been proven over and over. The other thing that it emits in large quantities is greenhouse gases. So chemical recycling is, according to the industry, the chemical industry itself, less efficient than creating new plastic. It produces more greenhouse gas emissions than creating new plastic. Obviously, creating new plastic is terrible for the environment and releases incredibly large amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. But chemical recycling has been shown to produce up to 100 times more greenhouse gas emissions, which is completely wild. It boggles the mind. As for these toxics higher up on this list, they have pretty negative impacts. You've probably heard of many of them and probably have some knowledge about what they cause. But exposure to them can increase risk of cancer, birth defects, reproductive damage, development issues, cardiovascular problems, respiratory impairment, hormonal irregularities, and neurological damage. The impacts of these cannot be overstated, and many of these things, heavy metals, PFAS, once those are in the environment, they do not go away. They have to be specifically worked against, or they will always be there. And as with most things, the impacts of these are disproportionate. They impact high-risk groups more severely. So we're talking about the elderly. We're talking about children. We're talking about anyone with existing respiratory problems or cardiovascular problems. Lots and lots of existing health issues. And all of this damage, all of this harm, all of this pollution, this is true when these facilities are operating under normal circumstances. They are producing these emissions and the incredibly toxic char. But what happens if things don't work as they should? All of this harm is there when it's working. But then we have to talk about some of the direct hazards of chemical recycling. So we have things like leaks. So at a chemical recycling facility, that low-grade oil has to be transported from one place to another. It has to be stored until it can be taken to a different refinery to be turned into fuel, or sometimes the refinery is on site. In either case, that oil is being moved through pipes, moved through storage. These things leak. No system is leak-proof, no system is perfect, and that is not something you want in your groundwater, in your surface water, even on your land. It is incredibly, incredibly toxic. So any leak is a risk. Talking about the char too, that is stored on site until it can be disposed as a hazardous waste, but it is going to be a hazardous waste, sometimes indefinitely, if it's contaminated with PFAS. So storing that is always a risk. Let's talk about transportation. So we need to transport this pyrolysis oil, this low-grade oil. How are we doing that? We're doing that on buses, not buses. We're doing that on tankers. We're doing that in trains. Unfortunately, tankers crash and trains derail. We've seen that. So an example of this was in East Palestine, Ohio, fairly recently. A train derailed. The train was carrying a lot of toxic substances, and that city is contaminated, and it is an incredible amount of work to try and clear, and those people were exposed to incredibly harmful chemicals. Leaks and spills happen under normal circumstances, but they are the most extreme instance. Things that shouldn't happen under normal circumstances are things like fires. But chemical recycling facilities operate under high heat and pressure circumstances. So we talked about that incinerator, right? The pyrolysis incinerator. That is involving a lot of heat to melt that down. And there are other steps to that process that also involve a lot of heat. Fires happen. They happen at these facilities at an alarming rate. An example from Tyler, Texas, there was a facility, a chemical recycling facility that had 4 different fires since 2020. So that's 5 years, 4 fires. That is not unique, unfortunately. These facilities are risky. But the risk from fire is the direct risk to people working in the facilities, of course, and sometimes in unfortunate instances, we're going to talk about a little later, sometimes communities that are too close to these facilities because they're built places they shouldn't be. But another major risk from a fire is the smoke, because the smoke, it's burning the plastic, it's burning the oil, it's burning all of the chemicals involved. It's carrying all of those contaminants, the heavy metals, the dioxins, it's carrying all of that in a completely unmitigated form into the air and the smoke. It is hard to overstate the toxic load of this smoke and the risk that it poses to communities nearby, but even far away, because once it gets into the air, it can be carried a pretty sizable distance. These pictures are actually photos of a fire at a chemical recycling facility. And the last thing, in some ways, the most extreme possible direct hazard are explosions. The reality is, whenever you're operating in a high temperature and pressure environment with chemicals that are reactive, explosions can happen, and sometimes they do. And they are a very real risk to both workers at facilities, but also to any homes, communities, anywhere near these facilities. So we've talked a little bit about the health risks. We've talked a little bit about the direct physical hazards. And now we need to talk about the wider context that these facilities exist in. Today, there are 8 running operational chemical recycling facilities in the United States. There are 3 under construction, and there are 37 more proposed. That 37 number is important, and you should remember it because there's a good chance that's actually going to grow for some reasons I'll talk about in a minute. We've just gone through how dangerous these facilities are and how risky it is to any communities around them and how contaminating it is just by being an existent process that goes on. So there are 8 now, there are 3 more, there's 37 proposed, even though these facilities are energy intensive. Running all that equipment, running an incinerator, sometimes up to like 16 hours a day, takes a lot of power, And oftentimes that means it is adding a burden to a grid that may otherwise be challenged by it. They are also incredibly expensive to operate. For the most part, these companies are losing money on these facilities because they are complicated. They require very specific equipment. They require specialized staff. They have lots and lots of other burdens and hurdles to get past. They're incredibly expensive to operate, and they tend to operate at a loss. They also are incredibly inefficient and ineffective. So we've talked about all the risks from it, but the reality is, if all 8 of the active facilities today were operating at full capacity, they would only be able to process 1.3% of the annual plastic waste in the United States. The reality is, the majority of these facilities are actually not operating at full capacity. They're not operating close to full capacity. They're operating at a pilot scale because of lots and lots of challenges for these facilities to actually function. They are ineffective, they are inefficient. The reality is, these are all reasons why a company wouldn't want to do this. So why is it being pushed so much? Why is this a technology that is being brought forward as important and something that we should be doing? The reality is there are 2 answers. 1, subsidies. So these facilities, chemical recycling facilities, are an avenue for companies to be able to capture subsidies. Because it is pitched as recycling, often they are given access to federal grants, states' tax abatements, and low-interest green bonds, as well as government loans at competitive rates. Oftentimes, they're getting money that is dedicated to green infrastructure and green projects instead of actually green projects. So it's a way for these companies to be able to capture some of these subsidies. In some instances, these are also facilities that can be reclassified as manufacturing, which makes them eligible for even more public money. An example of this is in Indiana. A facility received 4.5 million in grants and tax credits, plus another 185 million in tax-free bonds. So they're really a way for these companies to capture this federal money, and state money, to be clear. The other half of this equation about why is a narrative. So if you're a chemical company and you are creating plastic at a rate that has been unsustainable for decades, most chemical companies have, well, really all chemical companies, the entire industry has been aware that the rate at which they are producing plastic is completely unsustainable and is going to pollute the world, including ourselves. Microplastic in all our blood, that's proven at this point. They know that, they've known that. But having a technology like chemical recycling where you can say, hey, we have a solution over here. We're creating all this plastic, but we have a solution too, is really, really valuable from a narrative perspective. It's greenwashing. Ultimately, it's saying, here is a terrible process in an industry that is very destructive, but we've got this other thing that makes that okay. So between the subsidies and the greenwashing, you really have your answer to why. One last thing we need to touch on is shifting protections. Unfortunately, recently, the EPA has actually loosened some of the few protections that are in place for communities to be protected from chemical recycling. So what the EPA has done is it has eliminated structures and requirements for risk reviews of some of that fuel I talked about earlier. So the oil being transferred into fuel, suddenly the requirements for review are less or non-existent. There's really considerable worry that this will mean that 37 proposed facilities number from earlier might balloon. It might become even more common because there's very little preventing that. Very little preventing it, but not nothing. Now is a time when states and local governments really need to be taking action to protect residents from this technology and from the impacts and emissions from this. And there are some doing that currently. So California is actually suing ExxonMobil, which is the largest producer of plastic polymers, the building blocks of plastic, for deceiving the public about both its plastic production, but also about chemical recycling. They're suing them because ExxonMobil has been selling this as a panacea, miracle cure for the plastic problem. Maine is another example. Maine recently adopted a proactive set of regulations to say that chemical recycling needs to be more strictly regulated. It needs to be watched and controlled. And they also specifically stated that chemical recycling was not recycling. So I gave you a lot of information. I threw a lot of things at you. So let's do a quick summary. We've talked about what chemical recycling is. It is a dangerous set of technologies. It is greenwashing of an extremely dirty industry, and it may even be an excuse for that plastic industry to ramp up production because suddenly they have this magical solution that won't materialize, but can still give them an excuse. What is it not? It is not advanced. This is a technology that was originally developed in the 50s. It's been around for a very long time, and it's been a very bad idea for that entire time. It's not recycling. It's not really cyclical. Very small percentage gets turned into plastic. Vast majority gets turned into fuel that is incredibly toxic. It's not recycling. It's not circular. And it is not a solution for the plastic problem. We talked about how inefficient these facilities are. As little as 1.3%. It's actually less efficient than mechanical recycling by a pretty wide margin. Finally, it's not harmless. People are at risk here. People are being harmed, and people will continue to be harmed until something is done about this. Fundamentally, it is a pernicious bit of marketing. And we happen to have someone with us who knows a thing or two about marketing. So I'm going to hand it over to Shamika Preston.
Thank you so much. Um, I love the transition to me, so thank you. Um, welcome everybody, and let's move on to this marketing piece. All right. So one thing we know for sure is that the chemical industry, they are very good at communicating the ways they believe pyrolysis will benefit us, and they are very effective marketers. They have very good marketing machines. And I say that as a reformed marketer. I'm also a reformed New Yorker. So I have a master's degree in marketing, and I've studied many campaigns, I've created campaigns, and I've seen just how powerful words can be, how they can inspire, how they can persuade, and how they can move people to action. And I've also seen the flip side, how words can mislead and how pretty language can bury the truth. And that's why our job as advocates is to cut through the spin. We have to help community members, elected officials, and state regulators understand why there should be no exceptions for projects like all the 37 that Meher mentioned and the one that my community is standing up against. So let's talk about the pyrolysis incinerator that is coming to Howard County. W.R. Grace, a multinational chemical company, has a permit to operate. That's not really the technical term, but that's an easy to explain term. They have a permit to operate a plastics pyrolysis project that is 260 feet from the closest residential neighborhood. And within half a mile, there are about 260 homes. There are protected environmental areas. There's a river. There are hundreds of kids who, as we heard earlier, are among the most vulnerable to toxic emissions. They plan to incinerate thousands of pounds of plastics annually, and the plant is expected to run 16 hours a day, 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year for an undetermined number of years. To all the points that were made earlier, their plans include on-site fuel storage, transfer by truck, and these we know will increase the risks of leaks and other accidents, and there is no emergency plan in place. EPA has confirmed that pyrolysis units are incinerators, not recycling facilities. So I want to make sure that we are all clear that this is not my language. This is what the government has said. And though the process is expected to release carcinogens that are even listed in their the GRACE application, the Maryland Department of the Environment believes that the bench-style pilot pyrolysis plant deserves a research and development exception. So why do we think that this small little pilot plant is going to cause harm? Before I answer that question, I'm going to take us through something else that was marketed as small and harmless. All right, do we remember in 2015-ish when the modern vape pen came about? It was also called an e-cigarette, and it was a device that used heat. It still is around. It's a device that uses heat to change material so that someone can inhale vapor instead of smoke. So between 2018 and 2022, the global e-cigarette market doubled in value from 11 billion to 22 billion. And I bring this up because I think that the way it was marketed can tell us a lot about how beliefs are formed and why we should all take this small pilot plant very seriously. And I say that so-called small pilot plant. And I also think as a real world example that most of us have lived through and heard about, it makes it easier for us to understand what is happening when we hear about what the industry is telling us and what can really happen. All right, let's go on to the next one. Okay, so if you recall, and you don't have to because I have examples, vaping was sold to the public as a smoke-free, safer alternative to smoking. There's no smoke, there's no ash, they said. It's safer, it's healthier. Some even claimed it could be a smoking cessation device. The ads made vaping look stylish, and they said intelligent people vape. They claimed it's less polluting than conventional tobacco products. And you can do it anywhere, at work, in restaurants, and around friends. So, how much of this is already sounding familiar to what you heard earlier in the presentation? But don't worry, I have more. Okay, so you remember all the happy part, and then you remember when it turned a little bit dark, or very dark, I should say, because we found out that teen addiction soared and the truth about the health impacts of vaping really came to life. So we began to hear awful reports of young people suffering from lung disease. You may recall the term sticky lung or popcorn lung, and that's basically a more medical term is e-cigarette or vaping use associated lung injury. It's a disorder that is called EVALI, or like I said, sticky lung or popcorn lung. And a lot of young people started to experience this after vaping, and it could have just been a few months for some unfortunate youth. The effects took place very quickly, and it wasn't just lung diseases. It was cardiovascular issues and strokes. And do you want to know why? It's because nicotine is a toxic, addictive substance that harms these body parts. They harm the brain, they increase blood pressure and heart rate, and they contribute to these cardiovascular problems. And these are issues that we've known about for hundreds of years, right? But we still thought that we could innovate our way through it. Additionally, other chemicals like formaldehyde and heavy metals and VOCs were being inhaled with every puff. So even if you were not using your vape pen at that moment, it could still be dangerous. You all may recall that some vape pens just spontaneously combust, and they caused fires and explosions in homes and on airplanes. So again, I tell you this because I think it represents a great parallel with what we're talking about when we say chemical or advanced recycling, aka pyrolysis incineration, is dangerous. We just finished talking about a teeny weeny vape pen, right? And chemical companies are following the exact same playbook to confuse and obfuscate the truth. So let's look at what we're hearing across that industry. All right, advanced recycling has been branded as circular green solution. It'll help us recycle more plastic. And the companies say, allow us to do this and we'll save the planet. We'll turn plastic waste into valuable raw materials. The CEO of one advanced recycling company claims there's no odor, there's no burning, there's no incineration, AKA there's nothing to see here, people. And in some other instances, we've heard it'll protect marine life. And in the case of the pilot plant that's being planned near our house, W.R. Grace says that the solution has the potential to reduce emissions, save energy, and again, don't worry, it is a small pilot plant. So now you've heard the truth about pyrolysis, so I won't linger here too much longer. But toxic is toxic, right? We know that toxic emissions can cause health problems. We have heard that size doesn't matter. We know that vape pens and pyrolysis incinerators both use heat to change a material. So in the case of a vape pen, it's liquid. And in the case of the pyrolysis process that we've been talking about, is plastic. Neither fully destroys the substance. They both transform it into either gases, particles, or residues. In a vape pen, it's one person directly inhaling the chemicals, and we've seen what that impact looks like. In pyrolysis, it's the whole community being exposed to the chemical byproducts that are released through the air, or in the other ways that we talked about with the trucks, with the char and the leaks and all those things. And both can be extremely hazardous and harmful, no matter what the marketing says about them. We live through the vaping industry's kind of truth and exposure. And so I don't think we have to experience that again when other chemical companies are using the same playbook. And I will just close us out with just an offer for anyone who's on the call who wants to find out how to help in Howard County. Scan this QR code or visit this website. It's the Stop Grace Coalition website, and you can sign up for more information, and you can also sign a petition. And once you sign that petition, you'll be included on our email list, and you'll get more updates from us more regularly. Thank you very much to Meher and Clean Water Action for having me. And thank you to Lisa Kraus and Padma Swami of the Stop Grace Coalition for helping with the slides.
Now, we would like to open the floor up to all of you. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. And thanks for being here. I think that I'm going to bid adieu to the folks on the recording. So thanks for watching in the future, and we'll have some time for Q&A.